Hi, everyone. Welcome to the video version of the Reviving Vet Med podcast. In this episode, we're diving into a topic that often lives under the surface of veterinary work: grief, what it looks like, how it affects us, and why it matters. And today, I'm joined by one of our incredible Reviving Veterinary Medicine coaches, Kira Valentine. Kira is a licensed clinical social worker and certified veterinary technician with over 2 decades of experience in emergency and critical care, including 13 years in veterinary leadership. She brings a rare and powerful blend of clinical expertise, mental health training, and nonprofit leadership to her coaching and veterinary work. So, whether it's losing a patient, stepping away from a role, or simply holding space for others suffering, grief weaves its way through the everyday experiences of veterinary professionals, even though we rarely talk about it. In our conversation today, we explore the many forms that grief can take in vet med, how it often goes unrecognized, and how unprocessed grief can fuel burnout and compassion fatigue. Kira also shares how her personal and professional journey have shaped her passion for supporting veterinary team members through emotional healing. So, with that said, I'm really excited to share this powerful and deeply compassionate conversation with you. Let's go ahead and get into the episode. Hi, Kira. I'm so glad to have you on the podcast.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. You have had such a unique journey. You and I go way back. We used to work together at NC State when I was a baby resident and you were a technician. And from there, you've moved into licensed clinical social work. You're a leadership coach as well. What led you into this alternative path where you've had the opportunity to focus on grief, trauma, and emotional well-being in vet medicine?
Yeah, it has been a little bit of a winding road. And really, even before you and I met, I thought I wanted to be a veterinary neurologist. So I am not adverse to changing my ideas, that is for sure. But it's mostly comes out of need, and I think there's no one road that has led me here. I think way back when you and I were working together, I started to kind of see that there wasn't as much joy in veterinary medicine, and it made me start to wonder why that was and what is happening. And research on compassion fatigue had started to come out, and I was very interested in that sort of thing. So I got into leadership because I thought maybe a more compassionate, more understanding, more relational leadership style might help. And it certainly did. It did for sure. But there were also areas that I was like, ooh, I'm not sure I know enough to not do any damage and not be as helpful as I possibly can. So it kind of moved me more towards learning more about people and loving the people who do this work as much as I love the patients.
Mm.
Um, and also noticing that there were areas of our profession that made us uncomfortable. And it made me wonder what we could do about that and how we could make that better. Grief is certainly an area that makes people uncomfortable on a regular basis, but
Mhm.
it's such a big part of what we do. And it's those last loving moments of a client. So, us making sure that it's as smooth and as positive an experience as we can make it
Mhm.
really makes a difference in not only the client's experience, but our experience and this being meaningful work for us.
Oh my gosh, you brought up so many great things. I had no idea you wanted to be a neurologist. That is amazing.
Way
Um,
back when I was a wee one.
yeah, you know what? I love the notion of I see an issue and I want to jump in and see if I can fix it or do better or be better. I think that's incredible. One of the things you said really stuck with me, and that was this notion of the interplay between the client's experience and the team's experience when it comes to an end of life situation. And I'm reminded of an article that was published, I think it was in the Vet Record a few years ago, done through research that was done at the Ontario Vet College. And they interviewed team members to ask them about their experience with euthanasia, because I think the public perception is that euthanasia is so hard. I don't know how you do that. This must be the worst part of your job. And it was so interesting to read in that study that, in fact, when the end of life situation unfolded peacefully and nicely, and the client had a good experience, then that did in turn have a positive experience on the well-being of the veterinary team members, which is something I hadn't really thought of before. But looking back on my own experience, I can totally see, yeah, like when a euthanasia goes well, I feel so grateful. And that, as you said, this work is so meaningful that I can offer this peaceful passing, for this family. Um,
It's that relational piece, right? That piece where we're not here just for the animals. Like that's the beauty of veterinary medicine. There's always a human attached to these animals that we love, but finding meaning and just being in the presence of that loving relationship between the owners and their pets be incredibly meaningful for us too. Like my mentor actually says that all the time. She runs a grief support group for our two hospitals, and she says just it's so honoring to be in the presence of such love. And I think that some of the clients are like, oh wait, oh my grief is love. Ding ding ding. Like that makes so much sense to them. And then it's not such a taboo. It's like, oh my gosh, well, I can talk about love. I love my pet. Of course I loved my pet, and it makes it just such a easier topic to discuss when you kind of reframe it in the light of love.
Yeah, I love that. Gosh, what a great way to reframe it for sure. Make it more accessible. Speaking of grief, that is a constant undercurrent of the work that we do. Like, yes, euthanasia can go really well, but there are some times we're euthanizing patients that we've been caring for intensively, for more than a decade or whatever it might be. And yet we don't often talk about it. How do you define grief in this context? And what are some of the ways it shows up in the day-to-day lives of the veterinary team members?
I think most people do think of grief just as it relates to death.
Mm,
That's just a tiny sliver of what grief can be. Really, the definition of grief is the feelings that come about from any kind of loss, and they can be any loss, real or perceived. I think in veterinary medicine, we do see quite a bit of death because no pet lives as long as we want them to, and our lifespan is so much longer than theirs. So we do see that life cycle more often than other professions for sure. But I do think that we can experience losses in other ways too. And they might be big, they might be small, and it's different for everybody. And I think, you were starting to touch on a little bit of, this is the client's loss and how does it impact us? I think we don't want to rob the client of those experiences, but it's still grief for us too, because like you said, sometimes we are seeing these patients from the time they were puppies to
mhm,
the time they're old and gray. So
mhm,
it's a loss for us too.
mhm,
I think we are very mindful of not in encroaching on their experience, but we do also have to give ourselves some grace too that the grief belongs with us too. And it might be, did I do enough for this pet or did I give the best advice? Did I, all those kinds of things that go into, us feeling certain about what we're doing.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's so interesting. Yes, death is such a big part of what we do in practice, and yet grief can show up in so many different ways, in ways that I never really acknowledged before. You wrote a blog post for Reviving Veterinary Medicine called Beyond Grief, Understanding Death in All Its Forms. And in that post, you brought to light so many different circumstances where people can experience grief. I'd love for you to talk about some of those experiences.
Yeah. Well, and that really came about from a personal experience. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but I had a job that I absolutely loved. And through a corporate restructuring, I found myself without a seat at the table. And I found myself just so desperately sad. And it didn't really occur to me at first that it really was grief because I had lost this job. But it was really after talking to my husband, and he was like, well, yeah, you're not doing what you used to do every single day, and your life is very different than it was even a week ago. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah. So by calling it what it was, I was able to start really thinking about it in a different way
Mhm,
and thinking about well, why did that job matter to me so much? What parts of that job did I absolutely love and are going to look for again? And what parts am I like, oh gosh, I am so glad to be done with another 8 a.m. meeting. I don't want to do those again.
Mm,
Those sorts of things really gave me a compass and kind of set me in a direction of, well, I really loved taking care of staff and their needs and their emotional well-being, but do I know enough? So that's when I decided to go back to school and learn more about social work and learn more about how to help and support people.
mhm,
In that regard, grief can be a compass for any of us.
mhm,
We're finding that we have a loss and it is really impacting us and it's really affecting our day to day. And if we can get a little bit of perspective and say, well, why? Why did that loss hit me so deeply where another loss, maybe I just kind of rolled with it and went through it?
mhm,
That might give us some insight into ourselves and teach us something about ourselves that our feelings are telling us where our thoughts were kind of keeping it from us.
mhm,
Or, the reality of, well, how is it going to make that work? But your feelings are probably more honest than any thought you can have. So if we can pay attention to those, grief can actually be such a positive thing for us, and it can actually show us what matters to us and what we're passionate about and what we really, really love.
I love that. Again, such a great reframe, right? To look at grief as like I don't know, a signpost or something to like what is really underneath. I think of anger in that way. I tell people for the longest time, I thought anger was bad. I should never be angry and I should never lose my temper. And certainly we have to, be mindful of our actions when we become angry. But it's really helped me to recognize that anger is a secondary emotion. Like it's always because of something, some experience of envy where you recognize, I want that and I don't have it, or embarrassment, like I'm feeling embarrassed or maybe even shameful that I'm in this experience. And so I'm going to defend myself by getting angry or deflect or hurt feelings or, all of these different things. So I love that reference in terms of grief as well. It's interesting. So, what I'm hearing you say is that we can really experience grief because we lose a job, or maybe we lose a team member. Maybe a team member goes to another practice, right? Or the practice gets sold to corporate, and now we're in this like new structure, and we've lost that. Autonomy that, an independently owned practice has. It's interesting because I recently, in preparing for our conversation, I did a bit of a lit search on grief, and I was shocked at how little there is out there in the veterinary space specifically. But one paper came up, and that was a paper that came out of Lincoln Memorial University College of Vet Medicine, where they were interviewing vet students early in the pandemic to assess their response to the uncertainty of the pandemic. And the big theme that came up for them was around grief, like this uncertainty grief of like, what does the future hold? And this anticipatory grief of like, we're not going to have our graduation, we're not going to finish our rotations. What are your thoughts in response to that? Is that, something that we can maybe apply in different situations in vet medicine?
Yes, and how real is that feeling? And we're only just seeing that now as we're getting a little bit further away from the pandemic and when things opened back up, we're finding that interns and students at the time are feeling like kind of that loss of clinical rotations and that loss of in-person rounds and the loss of graduation. And how is that impacting their clinical practice now? Are they feeling like, well, I didn't have those things, so am I good enough? Do I know enough? So those could be entangling with all sorts of other emotions about feeling not good enough or imposter syndrome and that sort of thing, which, my gosh, we suffer from enough in veterinary medicine as it is, but adding in I didn't have the traditional experience as other veterinary students or other technician students can really be impactful for you just feeling comfortable and confident in your day.
Mhm.
Um, and those were really losses. Those were grief. I was expecting to be able to go to grand rounds and I was expecting to be able to hear that clinical professor that I've heard about speak to us, or, I was looking forward to who was going to be my graduation speaker, those sorts of things they might seem silly to some, but they are really impactful to others. And it just depends on your personal perspective of what
Mhm.
matters to you and what were you really looking forward to, and how is that going to change how you look at things going forward.
Mhm. Gosh, as we get into this conversation, it just really reminds me how complicated grief is. I think about, going back to what we started with, which was our pets, our patients. When a client loses a dog, for example, they don't just lose the dog, but they lose that daily routine of taking the dog for a walk, right? Or the daily presence of like their dog in the office while they work. And, I think about these situations as well. And similarly, just yeah, those daily changes that can happen. I remember when I first got hired at the Ontario Vet College after my residency, and there was a very renowned surgeon who had been there for a very long time who had suddenly passed away before I arrived. And it was recent enough that it was very heavy. You could see that when people talked about this surgeon, that they were very emotionally affected. And one of the biggest things that I heard was I just, from the residents in training was I just, I was so looking forward to working with him or learning from him or all of these things. So it's again, not just the loss of this colleague, this friend, this mentor, but this loss of what could have been. So yeah, it's just so multifaceted. You
It
know,
it's
yeah.
not only multifaceted, but it can be compounding. So
Mhm.
if you had that mentor that just reminds you of your grandfather who you lost too, like now you're feeling that loss and your grandfather's loss.
Ah.
It can be, it can, I mean, it just like there's so many things that can get wrapped up in it. And it might feel selfish because, that professor you hadn't even met, but
Mhm.
you could look forward and be like, oh man, I was really looking forward to learning from that person. That's a loss for me. And we
Mhm.
shouldn't feel selfish when we feel that kind of grief because it's a feeling and that is truly how you're feeling and that mattered to you.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter that you didn't know him.
Mhm.
It's that what you were dreaming about isn't going to happen now. And that is a loss.
It's so interesting. So I think that dovetails really nicely into the next question I wanted to ask you, which was around veterinary professionals not feeling entitled to grieve, whether it's after a euthanasia, a patient loss, leaving a job or like losing a colleague like this. What will you say to somebody who feels that their grief isn't valid or big enough?
Yeah. It really is such a personal thing. And something that maybe 10 years ago wouldn't have affected you might be affecting you now. And it's just your feelings. Feelings, we often think about feelings as being good or bad or negative or
Mhm.
positive, but really all feelings are just feelings. And the human experience is having an array of experiences.
Mhm.
And being able to recognize what that feeling is really where the learning comes and really the self-expression comes when you can say, "Oh, that's hitting me when I didn't expect it to. What is that? Oh,
Mhm.
maybe that's a loss." And or maybe I need to do some self-reflection of why did that particular pet hit me? Did it remind me of one of my dogs growing up, or did the owner look like my mom, or those
Mhm.
sorts of things. You don't really know necessarily why a feeling is hitting you until you take a moment.
Mhm.
And maybe that moment is not the best time to do it because I think we often feel like, oh gosh, we have a responsibility to keep it together so
Right.
that we can treat the next pet.
Mhm.
So we're going to just shove that to the side and kind of keep going with our day. But if we don't at some point reflect on why did that one hit us, it's
Mhm.
just going to compound and it's going to like get bigger than it needs to be,
Mhm.
and it's going to be harder to like disentangle if
Mhm.
you don't take the moment at some point. It might be, at the end of your day before you turn your car on. It
Mhm.
might be you take an afternoon and go see a movie and you think about it a little bit. Those sorts of things in the shower where you're shampooing your hair. Sometimes people have the best ideas in the shower.
Totally.
But we do need to like be brave enough to take that moment to do some self-reflection so that we can truly understand what matters to us and why it doesn't matter to us.
Yeah, I love that. It's so interesting. So many things come up as I hear you talking about that, and they're all like words of wisdom from social workers I've worked with in the past. And the first one is we need to name it to tame it, right? Just recognizing, you get to your car at the end of the day and you're like, well, that was a horrible day. Well, let's stop for a moment and think about what was horrible about it. What am I feeling? What's coming up for me? What are the thoughts, feelings, etc., that are arising? And when you stop to recognize, wow, we lost one of my favorite patients today, what I'm feeling is grief, then we can start to process it. And like you said, prevent it from compounding. I think the other thing is, and this is something that I've said to a lot of people, coaching clients and others, even in my family or my life, you got to feel it or it's going to keep coming up at the most inopportune times. Like if you keep shoving those feelings away, then at the worst, you're going to be in a situation that totally doesn't feel called for. And suddenly you're going to be a puddle of tears because
Yeah.
there's those feelings that you never processed from something that happened before. And they're going to find a way to come back up, whether you like it or not, until you can properly process them and move on. So.
Yes, they're like cataracts. They just keep building layers. Yeah, and changing your lens, and it keeps like distorting your vision. So if you really want to be able to see clearly again, you gotta get those taken care of.
You got to get that to the underlying cause. I love that. So when we don't process our grief, how can it contribute to burnout or compassion fatigue? And what are some signs that a person might be impacted by grief, like more deeply than they realized before?
Yeah, it's so funny to me because, well, not funny, haha, but you know what I mean. That people are always just surprised to find that the problem is them.
Mm.
Things happening with them, because one of the things that I see a lot of times with compounded grief and compassion fatigue and burnout is the blame game. And
Mm.
they start thinking it's like, if everybody else would just do what they're supposed to do, my life would be so much better. And it's like, ooh, but let's figure out what's going on with
Mhm.
you and how you're feeling about things, which is
Mhm.
so scary sometimes to have to really think about yourself and really think about how you're feeling. Um, because it's so much easier to just say, well, somebody else should change.
Mhm.
So a lot of times I see the blame game happen and it's like, oh, but what's happening with you? And they're like, no, 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 not we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about this TA isn't working. It's like, well, no, I
Mhm.
actually wonder about you and what's happening with you. Um, so that's one of the things that I see a lot of the times. I
Mhm.
think Bernie Brown said that too, that blame is just a discharge of pain and discomfort.
Mhm.
So when you're feeling uncomfortable about what's happening, it's so much easier to turn it outward. So
Mhm.
when you start to see a coworker or a staff member or even yourself
Mhm.
start to kind of think it's everybody else, that's the time to stop and get a moment of self-reflection and
Mhm.
maybe talk it through with a trusted person and be like, I am feeling like everything is everybody else's fault. What is happening with me?
Mhm.
But we also see grief is, it's specifically related to a loss, but the symptoms are very similar to depression and anxiety. So
Mhm.
you might be feeling fatigue, you might be feeling just the blahs,
Mhm.
being able to sleep really well, not eating really well, hypervigilance. Oh, that's another one that we see a lot.
Mhm.
We see that you're always looking for the next threat and you're always like waiting for the next thing to happen or taking on the world as your responsibility and everything has to be done by you and kind of that isolation. So those are things that kind of can be confusing because um the the way depression and anxiety is diagnosed is how deep it is, how impactful it is on your life, and how long it lasts.
Right.
Where grief can show the same symptoms, but it's specifically related to a loss. So I would want to
Mhm.
put an asterisk on this conversation that even though the symptoms are similar, if you're finding that you're not being able to function your daily life or it's
Mhm.
really persistent, that's the time to seek medical care and make sure that it's not a true depression or a true anxiety. Or
Mhm.
if you can't think of like what loss am I having, I'd want to make sure that people are getting the care
Yeah.
that they.
Yeah.
Because the symptoms just, they are so overlapping.
Totally, totally. And it's even the same with burnout, like in the later stages of burnout, there's a ton of overlap with depression. And I remember reading a really comprehensive paper dissecting how do we as mental health providers or other caregivers differentiate between depression and the late stages of burnout. And it does ultimately come down to the cause, as you said, like with burnout. It's usually or often a work related phenomenon, right? So there's some issue with work. And, in this case, for the individual, if there's some unprocessed grief at work, and that's just compounding, then that could be leading to burnout. And concurrently, they could also be having signs of, or symptoms of depression as well. So I agree. I think, always default to connecting with a mental health professional if you have any questions about, what you might be experiencing.
Yes.
You work a lot with veterinary leaders. You've been a leader in veterinary practice for some time now. What emotional burdens do you feel like practice managers or supervisors often carry? And in what ways might they suppress or ignore their own grief or exhaustion?
So there's, and I'm not sure if this is in other fields because I have only ever worked in veterinary medicine, except for those little jobs here and there. But I feel like in veterinary medicine, we tend to promote people who are the best at their jobs. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we promote the best veterinarian to the chief medical officer. We promote the best technician to the supervisor or the practice manager.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't give them a lot of education for it or training for it or support for it. So
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times people end up in a leadership role and they feel like they have to be, those the cartoons where people are spinning plates. They
Mm-hmm.
probably used to do that in vaudeville, right? And they just feel like they have to keep a dozen plates spinning in the air at all times, and no one's ever told them how to spin a plate, so they're just kind of like winging it. So I think the idea of I have to put one more plate up there to take care of myself. What are you asking? That's asking too much. But it's not, because if we don't put that plate in the air first, all the other plates are going to come down at some point. Just like we were talking about before, that those compounded feelings are going to come out at some point or another. And I think that it really does a number on our veterinary leaders when they think that that's a fault.
Mm-hmm.
Fault to be a human. It's not a fault to say, I don't actually know what I'm doing. I need some help. Um, it's so important for veterinary leaders to have some educational background or be exposed to some training or have a mentor. There's so many times that veterinary leaders are legally not allowed to share information. And if you're at a practice that you're the only leader, there's legally no one you can talk to.
So I,
So
mm-hmm.
yeah, so building a community, because if we don't kind of give each other that support, it's it really is kind of an impossible hill to climb.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think that veterinary leaders, they think that they just have to take it all on themselves. And they've seen good leaders and they've seen bad leaders, and they don't want to be one of the bad leaders, so they're just going to keep working harder and harder.
Yeah.
But it really, the community is really important when you get to a leadership position.
Yeah. Yeah, no, such great words of advice. And, I think going back to our, the point about grief, I imagine too, as a leader, you're carrying so much. If you there's, as we know, there's so much turnover in vet medicine. There's a lot of attrition, a lot of technicians and nurses, especially, but even client care representatives, veterinarians, et cetera, are leaving jobs. And there must be some loss in that for the manager or supervisor or practice owner that just feels like it's compounded sort of by like, what did I do wrong? How did I fail them? Did I not work hard enough? And all of these expectations they're putting on themselves. So just, so much going through and compounding things as well. Um, what is something that team members might be able to do? Sorry, what is something that leaders of teams might be able to do to support their team members who might be going through one of these grief scenarios? What would be helpful for them?
Yeah. So I very much believe in relational leadership. I feel like, especially in this kind of field, I call veterinary medicine an intrinsic field because there aren't a whole lot of like bells and whistles that we get from being in this field except from ourselves. So it like the passion for wanting to do this comes from inside us. So I feel like relationships are really how we maintain this field and how we maintain wanting to be here.
Mm,
So if leaders can kind of develop those relationships with their staff on the good days, then you're going to notice when you're walking by somebody and you say, "How's it going?" And not in the way where you're like, you use "how's it going" as a greeting and you just keep going, like, "How's it going?" And stop, stop for a second, pause. That person who says, "Oh, I'm peachy keen" every single day, and then one day they say, "I'm okay." You're like, "Oh, wait, that's what you
mhm,
usually say to me.
mm,
Just okay today." And then you can start asking some more questions about what's going on. And
mm,
sometimes you can catch something before somebody even realizes it themselves. In social work, there's a kind of an acronym for these kinds of conversations called ORs, and it's asking open-ended questions. So those questions that are inspiring people to not give one-word answers. They're asking people their thoughts and feelings.
mhm,
Affirmation, so validating how somebody actually is feeling about something and that like their feelings are worthwhile. Um, ours is reflective listening. So, kind of active listening. I'm not just listening to respond, but I'm listening to gain understanding of what's happening with this person. And then the S is for summarizing. So,
mm,
being able to repeat back that I'm understanding what you're saying, and
mm,
my own words are kind of also validating what you're saying to me.
mm,
So if leaders can learn those kinds of communication skills, it really does make that relationship more solid. So people feel more comfortable when something's not going well to be able to say, "Actually, you're right. I'm not great today. Can
mm,
we talk about it?" And sometimes it's something happening outside of work and they just need to kind of spill their guts a little bit, and that's okay. I
mhm.
have in my office, I have an emotional chicken that people are allowed to hold
Oh my gosh.
and they need to hold Eleanor. She's
Is
a
this a
knit.
stuffy or a live chicken?
She's a knitted.
Okay.
I, imagine if I had a real hen. That'd be so funny. Uh, but yeah, sometimes people just
I'm like, just to clarify.
it could be. Yeah, so they can come in, and sometimes you just need to give Eleanor a hug, and that's fine. But sometimes it's something that I can actually help with. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed today, and I can kind of help figure out priorities with them. Or, we're missing some supplies that we really need to do our job. Oh, let me look into that. Oh, we have three of them broken. Let me see where they are in repair. So sometimes it's something that I can quickly do something about, but sometimes it's just they need to talk about it. But
Yeah.
having that relationship makes that just okay into something meaningful and something maybe we can do something about.
Mhm. I love that. Oh, you have such great wisdom and advice to offer. I love that you're really working towards supporting other leaders because, as you said, so many of us kind of fall into these roles, but we don't really have the training and skills. And so I love tangible things like the ORS acronym and other things that can be helpful. As we wrap up towards the end of our conversation here, what is one grief related insight or practice that you wish every veterinary professional had in their back pocket?
I think we've already touched on it a little bit that grief is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a
Mhm.
feeling. And really, we can use it to kind of guide us and give us a compass and show us what is really meaningful for us.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that if we can look at it as something that's not scary, that should be shied away from, we can learn so much about ourselves and the people that matter to us.
I love that. Okay, then last but not least, the final question, what does reviving veterinary medicine mean to you as a phrase?
Yes. Well, I mean, first, I love the double meaning because as criticalist, you probably have revived plenty of patients, but I also just love the idea of bringing back meaning and joy and fulfillment in this field because I love this field. I
Mhm.
love the people who do this work and I love the animals that we save. So bringing this into more of a long-term, sustainable, fulfilling career, it just makes my heart sing.
I love it. I feel the exact same way. And I'm so glad that we had this time together today. Such great thoughts and perspectives that you shared with us. So thank you so much for your time today, Kira. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you. Have a great one.
Yes, you too.